Hello and welcome to our first ever recorded coffee talk. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that rising senior to-do list, which I'm sure feels like it keeps growing. So let's talk through the most important things and the things you should be focusing on as we head through into the spring, the summer, and then ultimately the fall of senior year. So first, I think it's important to know where we've been in order to know where we're going. And you can see here we've done a lot in class. We do this through class. We do this through one-on-one meetings. We do this during course selection. So we meet with your guys quite a bit. And we talk a lot about the Naviance capabilities, how to search, not just what to search. We talk about college terminology so that we're all using the same terms to come to the same conclusions on things. We talk about meaningful college visits. We talk about what colleges look for in admissions. Ultimately, we will also run them through a full-blown admissions process. We started the college resume in the fall, and we do constant updates through class. We'll be getting ready to start our first draft of the college essay. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a future slide. We've been working on financial literacy through a program called Inquiry that was designed by one of our very own alums. The next things coming up, we've got some more about requesting teacher recommendations. We'll talk a lot about that on a future slide. We've talked about testing. We will talk a little about it today again as well. And of course, financial aid and scholarship. So this is truly a process, which is why we are so lucky to have the course that we do here. We're so lucky to be able to have this time with your sons one-on-one. So we're very thankful for the time that we get to spend with them. So first, let's talk a little about creating the application list. We use a lot of resources, and we hope that you're using them as well. First and foremost is Naviance. Naviance is the single most powerful search engine inside of it, called Supermatch, and it really is one of the best ways to work on that college list. Because while we work on it with them in class, we work on it with them in one-on-one, we hope that you're working on it with them as well. Your input is really important. Whether you think they're listening or not, they are listening to you. So we encourage you to look at the scattergrams and dashboards, which is very specific on Holy Ghost students that have applied and been accepted. I think that's even more valuable than these big overall statistics for admissions. You can also use the College Board for helping to create an application list. Obviously, visiting college is one of the best ways to work on that application list, sometimes to add schools and sometimes to drop schools off that list. And of course, our continued meetings. We often build these lists in the Students Naviance colleges I'm thinking about area, which will then ultimately get switched over to their colleges they're applying to list when the time comes early in the fall. So let's talk a little about that college visit. The college visit is really important, and it can really tell us where we should be applying. It can help inform us on the kinds of schools we like and don't like. So even if you haven't started visiting yet, now is the time to go. Let them see a big school, a small school, a suburban school, an urban school, a rural school. We're so lucky to live where we are that within an hour you can see almost all of those things so that your son can start eliminating. Let's say he doesn't like the big school feel, or he really loves the suburban school feel. And so those things can really help him make some decisions that will narrow down that list a little bit before you start spending the money and the time traveling further away. Remember, if you can't go in person, not a big deal. Definitely do a virtual visit. I always joke with the guys that even if you hate the school colors, we can eliminate it based off of that, but you got to get on their website and go check them out first. We also encourage you to demonstrate sincere interest. And what does that mean? The visit itself is a sincere interest, but a follow-up thank you email, asking questions that maybe can't be covered just on a website. Maybe your son wants to be connected with somebody in the math department who's interested in the same area of engineering that he is, but wants to ask these certain kinds of questions. Those kinds of things are sincere interest. And I think that that's really important to understand. We do encourage you on these visits to let your son ask the questions, but we understand they're not asking some of the questions that you know are very important or that you need answers to. So save those questions for you, but empower him with questions that he can ask that you know he's interested in. The other piece with this is the college visit is not just about you going to the colleges, but the colleges come to us. They come to us in our spring interview day. They come to us in the fall. We have more than 100 schools come and visit us in the fall. And so that is also a valuable piece of the college visit. It's also a great show for demonstrated interest. And so it is really important to remember that it's not just about going there, but going to them when they're here is really a good thing. And for your sons, obviously, we'll resume those visits again in the fall. This spring will be saved solely for the spring interview day. So let's build on this a little bit more. Some of the other things to think about: testing and test prep. You've heard these terms before, the ACT, the SAT. They're the most common tests out there. We encourage that everybody take at least one of them at least one time, though we do encourage maybe 2 times, 3 if really needed. And the prep piece of this, what is best to do? Every person is different. So there's always those test prep courses, but there's also one-on-one tutors, and you might be surprised that the tutoring could end up being cheaper than doing the course, especially if your son really just needs to focus on one area rather than say everything about the test. So it is something to think about and something we'd be glad to talk to you about in terms of what is your best strategy here. The other thing we want to mention is the SAT subject tests, also known as the SAT 2s. SAT subject tests are in the areas of different languages, physics, biology, chemistry, Math 1, Math 2, all sorts of different areas. And most schools don't require this, but there are some, especially those usually falling in the top 50, top 100, that recommend taking one or more of these tests. We will tell your sons over and over again, if it's recommended, it's required. We don't want them to miss out on something because they didn't take advantage of doing the thing that was recommended. So the most number we've seen in terms of a recommendation for subject tests is 3. But having 1 or 2 under their belt is not necessarily a bad idea to have. But this is where research should be done in advance. Look at the schools that your son's interested in. Do any of them recommend the SAT 2s? Some schools won't even take them, so we don't want to waste time either. So it's time to start doing that research. The best time to take these subject tests are actually with the May SAT testing date. Instead of taking the SAT, they can take the SAT subject test. It's a great time because they're coming fresh out of class, they're getting ready for finals, they're studying, maybe they took an AP test recently in the same topic, so they're really probably best prepared for those subject tests at that time. It may sound like a lot, but it probably should save them some work down the road in terms of preparation. The next big thing is going to be that letter of recommendation. And that letter of recommendation process actually hasn't even come about yet. Your sons barely even know it's coming. And so you're going to be the first to know. But there's nothing for anyone to do right now. But we want to tell you that we do require your sons to find 2 academic source recommendation letters. At least one of them must be from a junior year teacher. Then, of course, they get their counselor letter of recommendation automatically. And if your son has someone on the outside that he thinks would be a great recommendation letter writer, have him do that, especially if it's a boss or a scout troop leader, or maybe your son volunteers outside of Holy Ghost, somebody who can write them a wonderful recommendation letter that is separate of what they're going to get in the academics and the counselor record. Recommendation can be really important for their application. It cannot come from a family member. Even if the family member is the employer, there must be somebody else there who can probably write a letter of recommendation. So we want to really think about that we don't want that letter to come from a parent. And you would be surprised on the college side how many times they see it come from like parents, aunts and uncles, etc. When they get into this process, it is a 3-step process. And step 1 is requesting a recommendation letter face-to-face. We're trying to make this process as real life as possible, since one day they will be asking for recommendation letters for jobs. Then we tell them they need to follow up with an email to the teachers that have agreed to writing the recommendation letters. And then the third piece is they put the request in Naviance. This will all be due by May 10th, but like we said, we have not even assigned this yet to your son, so there's nothing for anybody to do. We just want to make you aware of the process. This can be an important differentiator in that admissions process, and so we want to really think through who is the best writer for your son. You are an important voice in that. We can help you the voice in that. We want to think this through, and that's what we're here to do with you. Next is the essay. This we have not started in class, but we will very, very soon, because the Common Application just put out their essay prompts. And most essay prompts can stem from a Common App, even if they're not using Common App. So it's a great place to start with that essay writing process. So the first one that they're going to write really fits that Common App prompt, and then they can refine it, restart it, reuse it possibly, depending on what another school is asking for. But it is really important to note that these are not the only essay prompts, and in many cases, schools are asking for more than one essay. So to refer back to the testing piece, we do recommend you start doing the research now when you're on those websites. Are there additional essays? Will there be an additional essay? What have they done traditionally in the past? Note that most schools will not release any additional essay prompts themselves until August 1st, which is when they will open up their new applications. Common App just released theirs early, which is why we're able to start writing the essays in class. A couple of things to think about is be genuine and tell a story, but tell a story about your son, right? So maybe they want to talk about their grandfather, but in the end, the admissions office isn't admitting their grandfather, they're admitting your son. And so help your son find a way maybe to tell the story about his grandfather that he admires so much, but what has that brought to him? And so you are really important in the essay. Often you know some of the best stories. And so help him keep his voice, find his voice maybe to even get started and tell that story as part of the essay. So next, Naviance. We've covered this a lot. We know we've done sessions with you, etc. First, let me say, if you have not been in your Naviance account or can't remember how to get in as a parent, not a problem. Please contact Mrs. Kudla at tkudla, T-K-U-D-L-A, at holyghostprep.org. She'd be glad to get you set up and ready to jump back into Naviance so that you can be seeing the work your son is doing. It is also important that you're not in your son's account so that you don't make changes or do requests that maybe shouldn't be in there. So we do ask that you please use your account, but you can see what your son is doing. This is where you're going to work on the college list. It's the biggest part of the summer process. If there was ever a to-do list, it's working on the college list. We hope that when your son gets back in September, we are just finalizing where they're applying. That's always our goal. And then we can refine it a little bit as time goes on, but that the bulk of the work is done and ready so that they're really hitting the ground running with applications, finishing up essays, having documents sent, etc. Naviance moving forward is really going to be used for posting outside scholarship opportunities, managing the application materials, what goes out and to whom and when, special announcements for seniors. It's also where they sign up for their college visits when the colleges come to Holy Ghost. And it's just really that control panel. And we need it to be kept up to date. And we'll remind your sons many times of this, but you can do the same and help us with that. So a couple more things as we look at this. First is the college applications. We start the Common Application in class late this spring before they leave for school. The new Common App itself opens up on August 1st, but all the work that we do in class in the spring will automatically roll over on August 1st, which is why we have the ability to start that early. This is not the case for most other applications and pretty much for any other college's applications. So that is why we don't encourage you to start those other applications, but maybe take a look at them, see what they require, but don't waste the time doing the work that's going to get lost. So a couple of best practices when it comes to college applications after August 1st. Starting it early is always a plus. The more they can get done in August before they get back here on those rainy afternoons is really going to make a big difference. It's also great to work on the additional essays after August 1 when they're all released. Take a look at his top schools. What other essays are they requiring? And start working on those. Any test prep that might need to be done for a final test in August or September should be done late in the summer. Try to finalize a college list ideally as much as you can. And then we will meet with your sons in early September to finalize that list. We'll talk about next steps. There is no one process that works for every single school when it comes to the application process. So we will talk through every school with your son. Obviously, we want them to be submitting their applications based upon those agreed upon deadlines. So we'll talk to them about those different kinds of deadlines. That's actually one of my next slides. We'll talk about that in a moment, and we'll help decide with you and your family what is the best time for them to apply. What you can do in all of this, though, is help keep your son organized. It is so much back and forth paperwork. Did I do this? Are we done this? That he needs your help with this. And so no matter how organized he is, help keep him that way or help him get started in whatever way is best for him. So really quickly, we just want to review those deadlines since we've mentioned them. There's a couple of different deadline types. Type 1 is ED or early decision. There's often an early decision 1 and an early decision 2. The key thing here to know about early decision is that you may only apply to one school early decision. And if your son gets in, he must attend. It is binding. So only one school can be applied to early decision. And if he gets in, it is binding. Then there's early action or EA. Early action, apply to as many schools early action as you want. You find out early whether or not you got in, but it's non-binding. So we encourage students to take advantage of early action anytime that it's offered. Next is restrictive early action. We're seeing this disappear as time goes on, but restrictive early action or REA is essentially you can apply to one school early action, but if you get in, you're not bound to go. So it's kind of a combination of the first two. There's some nuances to it. So if your son is looking at a restrictive action school, we should talk about that and make sure that that's the right strategy. Then there's regular decision, which you'll often see shortened to RG or RD. And regular decision is just kind of that last deadline date to apply by. Then you've got rolling admissions. So generally with a school that's rolling admissions, as they're getting applications and reading them, when the application is complete, they're usually reading them within 2 to 4 weeks, and you're usually getting a decision within 4 to 6 weeks in your hands. And so it just rolls from those applications being complete. And then there's a priority deadline, which can be a little bit similar to an early action deadline. It's just a priority deadline, a deadline that's suggested they apply by this date because, and you can insert your reason here. And so you'll see that in some cases for schools. Financial aid, we could spend an hour on financial aid, but we are not going to today. Instead, I encourage you to join us for our financial aid night that we'll have in the fall. And as soon as we have that date, we'll share that with you. But this piece is key in that you pay attention to deadlines. This is another piece where help your son stay organized. File the FAFSA on October 1 or shortly thereafter. It uses your 2017 taxes. So in most cases, you'll have your taxes done and it shouldn't be quite as bad to do as it was many years ago. Then you're going to want to check and see if any of your schools use that CSS profile or a version of that. That CSS profile is an additional form that takes into account other assets and debts that the FAFSA does not. So you want to know whether or not your school requires it because it is a lot of extra work in some cases. When you're doing your research on, does my school require the subject test? Does my school have extra essays? One of the other things you want to look for is, does my school require a CSS profile? Sometimes it's also just called the profile, and so you can Google that. And then, of course, there's scholarships and grants. And just to give you just a very brief sense, scholarships are merit-based monies you do not have to pay back. Grants are need-based money you do not have to pay back. And then you can receive talent scholarships. There's other outside opportunities and scholarships and grants. And so the key, though, is that some are merit-based and some are need-based, and they're all a little bit different. We have a lot of websites on our Naviance site that are good search engines for finding outside scholarships. And we encourage students to start looking at that. Parents, you're welcome to start looking at ones too to send to your son for him to apply to. So that takes some time. So we encourage you to do that early rather than later. And that can be done during the 4 years while they're in school as well. College athletes. So the thing to know here is that if your son is thinking about playing Division I, Division II, Division III, he should just be aware of the NCAA. If he's thinking about Division I or Division II, there is an eligibility center, and that eligibility center will determine whether or not your son is eligible to play. It's based off a sliding scale of SAT, ACT, and their GPA. There are also things known as official visits if they're a recruited athlete, and then the National Letter of Intent, the NLI, which is the last thing that they'll sign if they decide they're going to play for a specific college or university. But this is one where every student's process for athletics is going to look different. So if your son is an athlete and wants to be recruited, we encourage that he reach out to his counselor or specifically to Mrs. Campbell, as she's the NCAA liaison. So there are ways that we are going to help guide this whole process, but it is an individualized process. Okay, so next, there we go. The role of the parent, and probably one of the most important slides on here for you. Really encourage visits. Please take them to visits even if sometimes they don't want to. Ask the parent questions, let them ask the student questions, but never let an important question slip by. So even if it's one your son should be asking, but he's embarrassed or uncomfortable asking, go ahead and ask it for him to make sure that all questions are truly answered. Help keep your sons organized. Encourage them to do the outreach, phone calls, the emails, whatever it might be. Encourage them to be the number one who does that and that you can support them as they're doing it. Include them on the money conversation to the point that you're comfortable. This does not mean that you need to share with them all of your assets and all of the money you make and how much you've saved and those kinds of things. Not at all. But share with them what you might feel comfortable paying when they go to college, if anything. How much loan debt do you think they should take on or shouldn't take on? Have this kind of really important conversation with them because they actually really do want to know. So, and then last but certainly not least, we will have a lot of fall and evening programs as well. We're going to have a financial aid. We'll have our senior next steps, which is more nitty gritty now what's. And so there's a lot to happen between here and there. But really in the meantime, visit schools, look at schools online, start working on that college list. The rest starts to fall into place as we continue to move forward. As always, if you have questions, if you have concerns, if you want to meet with us one-on-one, if you want to meet with us with you and your son, that's what we're here for. So please do not hesitate to reach out to your son's counselor so that we can do that with you, and we will do that at your scheduled convenience. Well, we hope you enjoyed our first recording. If you have any feedback with the recording, please let us know because we do want to try to make this as accessible as possible for as many families as possible. Have a wonderful day.